Srimad Bhagavad Gita, Chapter 6. The Yoga of Meditation, Summary of the Sixth Discourse. Sri Krishna emphasizes once again that the yogi or sannyasi is one who has renounced the fruits of actions, not the actions themselves. The performance of actions without an eye on their fruits brings about the purification of the mind. Only a purified mind, a mind free from desires, can engage itself in constant meditation on the Atma. Desire gives rise to imagination or sankalp, which drives the soul into the field of action. Therefore, none can realize permanent freedom and tranquility of mind without renouncing the desires. The lower self must be controlled by the higher self. All the lower impulses of the body, mind, and senses must be controlled by the powers of the higher self. Then the higher self becomes one's friend. He who has perfect control of the mind, body, and senses and is united with God sees God in all objects and beings. He sees inwardly that there is no difference between gold and stone, between friends and enemies, between the righteous and the unrighteous. He is perfectly harmonized. Sri Krishna proceeds to give various practical hints as to the practice of meditation. The aspirant should select a secluded spot where there is no likelihood of disturbance. He should arrange his meditation seat properly and sit in a comfortable posture with the head, neck, and spine erect but not tensed. He should fix his purified mind on the Atma by concentrating between the eyebrows or on the tip of the nose. The practice of brahmacharya is absolutely necessary for one to succeed in meditation. The conservation and transformation of the vital fluid into spiritual energy gives immense power of concentration. Fearlessness, too, is an essential quality on the Godward path. It is faith in the sustaining protection and grace of God. The aspirant is advised to practice moderation in his daily habits, in eating, sleeping, recreation, etc. Extremes are to be avoided as they hinder the practice of meditation. Living a life of such moderation and gathering up all his forces and directing them towards meditation upon the Atma, the aspirant gradually transcends the senses and intellect and merges himself in the bliss-filled Atma. He finds that the bliss of the Atma is incomparable, that there is no gain greater than the self. Having thus attained perfect union with the self, the yogi no more descends into ignorance or delusion. He does not relish any more the pleasures of the senses. Lord Krishna again emphasizes that the concentration of the mind on the Atma should be like a steady flame in a windless place. This ultimately leads to the vision of the Lord in all beings and creatures. Arjuna is doubtful whether it is at all possible to engage the mind steadily on the higher self, as its very nature seems to be one of restlessness. Krishna assures him that the practice can succeed through vairagya or dispassion and constant effort. Arjuna wishes to know the fate of the aspirant who fails to realize the supreme in spite of his faith and sincerity. Krishna tells him that the accumulated power of his yogic practices will assure him a better place in the future birth, with more favorable conditions for sadhana. The aspirant will then be compelled to carry on his yogic practices with greater vigor and faith and will finally achieve God realization. Krishna concludes that the yogi, one who has attained union with the Supreme Lord, is superior to the ascetics, to the men of book knowledge and the men of action, as the latter have not transcended ignorance and merged in the self. Verse 1, the Blessed Lord said, "He who performs his bounden duty without depending on the fruits of his actions, he is a sannyasi and a yogi. One, not he who is without fire and without action. Do thou, O Arjuna, know yoga to be that which they call renunciation? No one can verily become a yogi who has not renounced thoughts. For a sage who wishes to attain to yoga Action is said to be the means. For the same sage who has attained to yoga, inaction or questions is said to be the means. When a man is not attached to the sense objects or to actions, having renounced all thoughts, then he is said to have attained to yoga. Let a man lift himself by his own self alone. Let him not lower himself, for this self alone is the friend of oneself, and this self alone is the enemy of oneself. The self is a friend of the self for whom one is conquered himself by the self, but to the unconquered self, this self stands in the position of an enemy, like the external foe. The Supreme Self of who is self-controlled and peaceful, is balanced in cold and heat, pleasure and pain, as also in honor and dishonor. The yogi, who is satisfied with the knowledge and the wisdom of the self, who has conquered the senses, and to whom a clod of earth, a piece of stone and gold are the same, is said to be harmonized. That is, it is said to have attained the state of Nirvikalpa Samidhi. He who is of the same mind to the good-hearted, friends, enemies, the indifferent, the neutral, the hateful, the relatives, the righteous and the unrighteous excels. Let the yogi try constantly to keep the mind steady, remaining in solitude, alone with the mind and the body controlled, and free from hope and greed, in a clean spot, having established a firm seat of his own, neither too high nor too low, made of a cloth, a skin, and kush grass, one over the other. There, having made the mind one-pointed, with the actions of the mind and the senses controlled, let him, seated on the seat, practice yoga for the purification of the self. Let him firmly hold his body, head and neck erect and perfectly still, gazing at the tip of his nose without looking around, serene-minded, fearless, firm in the vow of a brahmachari, having controlled the mind, thinking of me, and balanced in mind, let him sit, having me as his supreme goal. Thus, always keeping the mind balanced, the yogi with the mind controlled attains to the peace abiding in me, which culminates in liberation. Verily, yoga is not possible for him who eats too much, nor for him who does not eat at all, nor for him who sleeps too much, neither for him who is awake always, O Arjun. Yoga becomes the destroyer of pain for him who is always moderate in eating and recreation like walking, who is moderate in exertion in actions, who is moderate in sleep and wakefulness. When the perfectly controlled mind rests in the self alone, free from longing for the objects of desire, then it is said, he is united. As a lamp placed in a windless spot does not flicker, to such is compared the yogi of controlled mind, practicing yoga in the self or absorbed in the yoga of the self. When the mind restrained by the practice of yoga attains to quietude, and when, seeing the self by the self, he is satisfied in his own self, when he, the yogi, feels that infinite bliss which can be grasped by the pure intellect and which transcends the senses, and established wherein he never moves from the reality, which, having obtained, he thinks there is no other gain superior to it, wherein established he is not moved even by heavy sorrow. Let that be known by the name of yoga, the severance from union with pain. This yoga should be practiced with determination and with an under-responding mind. Abandoning without reserves all the desires born of sankalp and completely restraining the whole group of senses by the mind from all sides. Little by little, let him attain to quietude, by the intellect held firmly, having made the mind established itself in the self. Let him not think of anything. From whatever cause the restless, unsteady mind wanders away, from that let him restrain it and bring it under the control of the self alone. Supreme bliss verily comes to this yogi whose mind is quite peaceful, whose passion is quieted, who has become Brahma and who is free from sin. The yogi, always engaging the mind thus in the practice of yoga, freed from sins, easily enjoys the infinite bliss of contact with Brahma, the eternal. With the mind harmonized by yoga, he sees the self abiding in all beings and all beings in the self. He sees the same everywhere. He who sees me everywhere and sees everything in me, he does not become separated from me, nor do I become separated from him. He who, being established in unity, worships me, who dwells in all beings, that yogi abides in me. Whatever may be his mode of living, he who, through the likeness of the self, O Arjun, sees equality everywhere, be it pleasure or pain, he is regarded as the highest yogi. Verse 33, Arjuna now says, the yoga of equanimity taught by thee, O Krishna, I do not see its steady continuance because of restlessness of the mind. The mind verily is restless, turbulent, strong and unyielding, O Krishna. I deem it as difficult to control as to control the wind. The Blessed Lord said in verse 35, undoubtedly, O mighty armed Arjun, the mind is difficult to control and restless, but by practice and by dispassion, it may be restrained. I think that yoga is hard to be attained by one of uncontrolled self, but the self-controlled and striving one attains to it by the proper means. Arjun says, he who is unable to control himself, though he has the faith and whose mind wanders away from yoga, what end does he meet? Having failed to attain perfection in yoga, O Krishna, fallen from both, does he not perish like a rent cloud, supportless, O mighty armed Krishna, deluded on the path of Brahma? This doubt of mine, O Krishna, do thou completely dispel, because it is not possible for any but thee to dispel the doubt. The Blessed Lord said, O Arjun, neither in this world nor in the next world is there destruction for him. None, verily, who does good, O my son, ever comes to grief. Having attained to the worlds of the righteous and having dwelt there for everlasting years, he who fell from yoga is reborn in the house of the pure and wealthy. Or he is born in a family of even the wise yogis. Verily, a birth like this is very difficult to obtain in this world. There he comes in touch with the knowledge acquired in his former body and strives more than before for perfection, O Arjun. By that very former practice he is borne on in spite of himself. Even he who merely wishes to know yoga transcends the Brahmic word. But the yogi who strives with assiduity, purified of sins, and perfected gradually through many births, reaches the highest goal. The yogi is thought to be superior to the ascetics and even superior to men of knowledge obtained through the study of scriptures. He is also superior to men of action. Therefore, be thou a yogi, O Arjun. And the final verse 47, the Blessed Lord says, and among all the yogis, he who, full of faith and with his inner self merged in me, worships me, he is deemed by me to be the most devout. Hari Om, Tat Sat. Thus, in the Upanishads of the glorious Bhagavad Gita, the science of the eternal, the scripture of yoga, the dialogue between Sri Krishna and Arjun, ends a sixth discourse entitled The Yoga of Meditation.